history of classical music in Australia goes right back to white settlement in this country, the settlement made by European peoples at the end of the 18th century. Lands of the indigenous people were completely disenfranchised. People were killed, people were inflicted with various diseases that didn't exist in this land, and people were also inflicted with European culture. It must be acknowledged that a majority of the composers and works that I will talk about in this video were written before Indigenous peoples were recognised as an integral part of the Australian culture. By that I mean that the nation of Australia has been inherently created by white settler Anglo culture. In recent times, and I mean since the 1970s, classical music in Australia, along with many other aspects of Australian culture, has become more diverse and has accepted and embraced Indigenous art forms and creators. It must also be acknowledged that prior to, I would argue, the 1970s, the systems of classical music in place were representative of white settler culture in Australia. By that I mean predominantly English, Scottish and Irish settlement along the east and west coasts of Australia. It has only been in recent times, and I'm going to say again the past 20, 30, perhaps 40 years, where there has been significant engagement of Indigenous artists and Indigenous principles and culture in Western classical music. The most obvious of these is probably an acknowledgement of country that most organisations now commit to prior to the performance of a piece. And so I would also like to acknowledge that I live on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and that my learning, most of my creativity and most of the work that I have performed takes place on the lands of these people. Australian classical music is essentially, I would argue, an offshoot of activity that was going on in Britain around the late 18th century. So what you see in Australian settlement by white settlers around the 1790s and the early 19th century is music that is generally very folk music influenced. It's very salon influenced, so music was often written to be performed in small salon settings for perhaps more upper class or aristocratic or richer people. And the music that was heard predominantly on the street is probably more popular music like folk tunes and music hall variety music. Orchestras and opera performances were pretty regular in the early days of the colonies of Australia. However, we didn't really see the foundation of these organisations until the 20th century. A huge part of the development was the establishment of the ABC. Prior to the Second World War, there was certainly a lot of activity going on in all of the capital cities, but due to the nature and the size of those cities, there wasn't really huge amounts of music being produced. The most recognisable composer prior to the Second World War that Australia produced is arguably Percy Grainger. Percy Grainger was born and raised in Melbourne, but sent to Germany at quite a young age to study, and he went on to live the majority of his life in the United States. He was very proud of his Australian heritage, and I believe he's buried in the Melbourne Cemetery in Melbourne, but he, I would argue, is pretty much an American composer. He lived a majority of his life there, and he embraced a lot of aspects of American musical life. I would, however, recommend you listen to his largest and longest work, The Warriors, a wild, outrageous piece for 3 pianos, 13 percussionists, orchestra with an offstage brass band. It is a ballet score for a ballet that was never performed, and in classic Percy Grainger style, it has at its core racial content that is really tricky to talk about. He was arguably a white supremacist, or certainly he agreed and upheld beliefs about Nordic peoples being more able than other peoples, including other European races. And this work was a romanticized depiction of a battle between Zulu African warriors and white people. And I think The Warriors is good to listen to and research for that reason. Australia, prior to the Second World War and the huge amount of immigration that occurred in the 1950s, was a very parochial, a very white Anglo country, aside from, of course, the incredible indigenous culture that was disenfranchised by the Australian white government. The Warriors is a very interesting example of Australian culture at the time. It's written in 1913, just after Australian Federation, and the early period of Australian government saw the implementation of various key positions of the government, one being the White Australia policy, which disenfranchised immigrants and the indigenous peoples of the country. The fact that Percy Grainger is our most recognisable composer prior to the war is pretty endemic of the culture that was around in this country. So an obsession around race and the colour of one's skin, but also the dominance of a European way of thinking and European cultures. I'm mostly interested in composers from Australia of the past 60 years for that very reason. I find Warriors a really, really cool piece, but I do also take issue with a lot of what Percy Grainger said and stood for. And there is also some interesting discussion about him around the relationship he had with his mother, which was potentially a sexual incestuous relationship, and some very kind of peculiar personal traits that Percy Grainger had, but I'm not going to go into those right now. So he's a fascinating person to talk about, but there is a lot of issues with his personal beliefs. With the changes in immigration and Australian culture that occurred after the Second World War, around the time of the 1970s and the new government of Gough Whitlam, there was a real push for Australian identity, Australian culture, and a new revamped system for the way that art was funded in Australia by the establishment of the Australia Council. What this did was establish an almost renaissance of Australian music making in the 1970s, with some of our most important and significant composers rising to the top in that time. Another huge aspect of the development of Australian culture around that time was the opening of the Sydney Opera House, and then the eventual openings of the Arts Centre Melbourne in Melbourne and the Queensland Performing Arts Centre, which both established a permanent home for the orchestras and performing companies in those cities, those being the three largest cities of Australia. From this period, we cannot talk about Australian music without talking about Peter Sculthorpe, who was a composer from Tasmania but lived most of his life in Sydney. He's probably one of the most recognisable names of the past 60 years of Australian music, having produced some of our most landmark works. Peter Sculthorpe is an important person because of the music that he created, but also the trends that he brought into his music. He had a push towards more avant-garde techniques that were popular in Europe at the time. He embraced Asian cultures, and probably most importantly, he embraced indigenous Australian culture and really pushed for a recognition of indigenous cultural music making in his music. Another integral influence on the composers of this very fruitful period in the 1970s was, of course, the European and American avant-garde, and that was came to Australia through performances of works like The Rite of Spring, Pere Lunaire, and other landmark works of the early part of the 20th century, but it did take a long time for those works to be performed in Australia or recordings to be accessible in Australia. The influence was most felt on composers Nigel Butterley and Richard Meale, who both established very important teaching positions at universities in Australia, but also produced some major works of that time that have gone on to form very important cornerstones of Australian music making. I would argue especially the opera Voss by Richard Meale, and also Richard Meale's incredible Floridas, which is a remarkable work for chamber ensemble, which is based on the instrumentation of Percy. I spoke a little bit about Percy in my Arnold Schoenberg video, which I would recommend you watch if you need some context for the importance of that piece. This flourishing of ideas continued throughout the 1980s and 1990s, and I think it's most important to talk about Paul Keating, our Prime Minister, who in the early 90s had a real focus on performing arts, the arts in general, and a reformulation of Australian funding for the arts. He really pushed for the orchestras in Australia to grow, to be bigger, to take on a wider repertoire. He really pushed for Opera Australia to be more ambitious and to have larger repertoire and to approach more than just the bel canto Italian repertoire that it had traditionally done. And we did see throughout the 90s a huge growth in funding and resources for the arts. Also, a corporatisation of the arts led to more private philanthropy being brought in, as well as more private sponsorship from businesses, which led to a growth in companies. However, there has been a trend since the 1970s and this flourish in the 70s of Australian work. There has been a trend towards less Australian music and more bigger European traditional works being programmed. Some composers that have made their way into the Australian mainstream performing rosters that I really admire are composers like Ross Edwards, who was a student of Peter Sculthorpe and had a real focus on the Australian nature and Australian bush and how that can sound in his music. The composer Kate Neale, who has worked quite a lot in the Netherlands, and she's written some really fantastic work that explores aspects of Australian life that I would argue is outside of the tradition in Australian music making, which is usually focused on the natural world and the traditional kind of depiction of landscapes. We see in someone like Kate Neale and also a composer like Brett Dean a focus on more contemporary life, political problems, but also just abstract art as well. Yeah, I think there's a real wonderful avant-garde and abstract art practice in Australia, both in music and painting and theatre, and that is exemplified in those two composers who really embraced a push away from the traditional focus of what music is and what its purpose, Australian music's purpose, was in the concert hall. Another aspect that is really important to Australian music is, of course, the resurgence of Australian film in the 1990s, and a composer who is integral with that is Nigel Westlake, who was involved in a number of very important Australian films, but also international films, probably most recognisably Babe. The other trend that has really arisen in the past 20 years in Australia is this real focus on the avant-garde and abstract music making. And I think Melbourne in particular has an amazing community of music makers who are focused on this approach. The trend, as I said, in the 1970s was often around Australian cultural ideals, who we are, what is our music meant to sound like, and often that was depicted in images, musical images that were focused on the bush and landscapes and that sort of thing. I think as the country and the art scene in Australia has matured, we've matured into having a lot more focus being put into contemporary life and abstract interpretations of the world around us. One composer who I was lucky enough to actually study with, who's doing incredible things overseas, is Illean, and I would strongly recommend you listen to her music. The sensitivity, the sophistication, it's incredibly beautiful music and some of the best that's being made at the moment, I would argue. The final trend that I want to speak about is relatively new and it is exceptional, especially if we think back to what I was saying at the beginning of this video about the disenfranchisement of Indigenous peoples in this country. The music of Deborah Cheetham is remarkable, it's beautiful, it's incredibly sincere and incredibly sophisticated. She's been writing work about a lot of Indigenous stories and Indigenous storytelling, including Pecan Summer, the first opera written by an Indigenous composer. And so I would strongly recommend you listen to Deborah Cheetham's really heartfelt and beautiful music, and look into the work of her company, Short Black Opera, who do really wonderful projects around Indigenous opera singers, Indigenous singing, Indigenous cultural making, but also, of course, Indigenous music. The other project that is really important is the legacy and life of Gurrumul Yunupingu, who is mostly known to people as a more folk pop musician, but his very last collaboration before he unfortunately passed away was with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra and the Australian Chamber Orchestra, where he worked with composers on a orchestral telling of his songs. Some of those songs are traditional songs, some are original, and the album is incredible. It is a beautiful retelling of Indigenous music making, and pitched and performed in a way that is the traditional Anglo-Western orchestra. And so these two threads come together in a remarkable, highly sophisticated and beautiful way. And so I would strongly recommend you have a listen to that album. I have put together both a Spotify playlist, a YouTube playlist, and then some additional links and information below about these composers and these works. Not all of these composers are on those platforms. Not all of the works I talked about are easily accessible in recordings or videos, so it's a bit of a hodgepodge for this one, but I have put together as much information about them as I can. There's plenty of other composers I have not mentioned. Composer like Alfred, who was a lush romantic composer in the early 20th century, lived through the 1950s, who wrote huge amounts of music, is also worth having a listen to. The music, as I said, and life of Percy Grainger is absolutely fascinating, and I just always kind of laugh at the fact that he is the cornerstone of such a stuffy Anglo tradition in Australian music making. So he's definitely another composer to look at. Elena Kats-Chernin, who was an immigrant to this country and has brought with that an incredibly interesting background, and has put together a series of pieces that explore her tradition as well as her Australian life, and that's really fascinating and worth having a look into. So there's huge amounts of different approaches and styles in Australian music, and I would just say try and listen to as much as you can. I will be posting more regularly videos on my channel, so do comment, like, subscribe, and even share if you like some of the content that I am producing. Be sure to check out some of my other videos. I've got videos about orchestral music, I've got introductory videos about opera, but I've also got some more long-form essays about how composers work, and the music of Richard Wagner, who's a very controversial composer in the 19th century. So I'll be bringing out more videos like this in the coming days, so please stay tuned.